Okay, I've got a rare quiet hour in the house during this lockdown in Ireland in April 2020. So I'm going to press on and try to get to the end of this audio reading of this book, Cover Up of the Century by Daniel Ryder. And yeah, if we can find the third rare book, and there obviously are more books out there since as well. I've seen other people sharing some, but we'll plow on and get this documented, because even as I've done the readings, I've had people contact me and say, I wish I had that information, you know, when my child disclosed or so on. So we'll pick up from where we left off. Chapter 12, The Chosen. I'll put all these on a playlist. This chapter is based on a series of interviews with a woman who reports being an extremely, quote, connected satanic cult member. She recently broke away and provides more information about the inner workings and networking of the more sophisticated satanic cults. Dominique D., 40, reports being the oldest child of a satanic high priest in South Carolina. By virtue of the birth order, she was indoctrinated as, quote, the chosen in this particular transgenerational cult. She reports being involved in countless cult ceremonies, and because of her status, was also privy to a lot of inside information. In addition, she reports one of her uncles is a satanic high priest for a cult in North Carolina. And what's more, she said the uncle would sometimes take her along on, quote, training trips all over the United States and Canada, where he would typically address anywhere from 15 to 20 cult high priests or priestesses at a time. Dominique said the training topics included such things as generating money for the cult through pornography, breeding babies for sacrifice and for sale, kidnapping and recruitment techniques, torture and programming techniques, prostitution, money laundering. Brackets, Dominique is in hiding in another state. The names of members from her cult have been given to several law enforcement representatives. Snuff films. Dominique said the cults she was exposed to were into a lot of areas of pornography. The generated material for child pornography for the sadomasochist market, the most extreme level of the latter being snuff movies. Brackets, these are films where a victim is actually being killed on screen. Dominique said she was involved in the making of 3 snuff films, one in which she was designated to do the killing. She had been 8 years old at the time. She recounted parts of that. I refer you to Fraud and Corruption UK, both on Twitter and I think at Barcadelli on Twitter, and Fraud and Corruption UK on YouTube for some very in-depth evidence connecting the Hampstead alleged satanic ritual abuse cult to international porn distribution, including baby snuff movies. Right. She recounted parts of that. She said she was first put through a series of cleansing rituals. This is going to be a bit graphic, I apologize. With douches and enemas. She was then marked with an upside down satanic cross lightly cut into the skin in the groin area. Also, prior to the ritual, she said she was given something to drink that was drugged. At this point, she said a lot of cult member chanting started up, and she was programmed to respond to everything the cult members would tell her. Which one of the cult members told her was also, quote, everything Satan wanted her to do. I pray in Jesus' name, as I do every time I read and every day, for the blood of Jesus just to protect me, the once shed, never to be shed again sacrifice. And just for a guard on my mind, Holy Spirit, a helmet of salvation to guard my mind. And for everybody in earshot of my voice. Yeah. At this point, they also reinforced the Satanic belief, pain is pleasurable, said Dominique. This sounds very genuine. She was dressed in a white dress with imprinted Satanic symbols. The white was to symbolize purity and that you were technically married to Satan. The victim in this ceremony was a 3-year-old boy. Dominique said part of the photographer's purpose in a snuff film is to capture the expression on the victim's face, and young children, as opposed to babies, are generally used because of this. That's interesting. Dominique said the child to be sacrificed that day was somewhat drugged. That was so the child wouldn't struggle as much. But he wasn't too drugged, in order not to totally blunt the emotional expression at the time of the killing. Jesus. The child was laid naked on a Satanic altar. Then Dominique was instructed to mark the child with a, quote, holy knife. Light trace marks of upside-down crosses were made in 3 areas. They were made on each side of the groin area and on the forehead an inch from the hairline. Brackets, while this was going on, cult members were beginning to chant to Satan in the background. Then Dominique was led to a nearby fire. She's 8 years old, this child, where she and a high priest mutually gripped the knife handle, holding the blade over the flame. They reaffirmed all this was being done for Satan, their ruler. Dominique was then led back, the chanting growing louder. The camera zoomed in on her facial expression, the knife poised above the child. Quote, I am focused now. There is marked determination on my face, and I'm smiling. I believe it's for a better good. I believe it's right. Brackets, bad had become good. Real bad has become good. The camera moved to the young child's face. There's terror now. Eyes darting about for help, as Evandra's probably had. None came. The knife plunged into the young child's chest. The final scene showed the heart being taken out of the child. Blood was then drained from the heart into a, quote, holy chalice and passed around, said Dominique. Likewise, the heart was cut into pieces and eaten. Brackets, Satanism is again the antithesis of Christianity, and this type of thing is sometimes their version of, quote, communion. Dominique then related the child sacrifice that night had been her brother. He had been, quote, bred specifically for sacrifice. At this point in the interview, Dominic broke down sobbing. Copies of the film, said Dominique, would be sold to other satanic covens and used, for instance, to show children as part of the Code of Silence programming. That is, if they ever talked, they too would end up like the child on the screen. The films, said Dominique, were also sold to pornographers in the United States and internationally. And this is an area where we can pin down some of these bastards. If the law enforcement people specializing in cybercrime and child exploitation can locate these documents that prove what these children or adult survivors are saying, it will go a huge way to not only validating that this exists, but prosecuting the bastards who do it. Excuse me. One of the cult connections, said Dominique, was with an art gallery owner. Aha, how interesting. Think, what's it called? Pegasus Art Gallery owned by Alefantis. That's interesting. An art gallery owner in New York City. Dominic said the gallery owner's distribution sources included mafia contacts, underground sadomasochistic groups, and so on. Wow. Pornographic indoctrination. Dominique said sexual indoctrination and use in pornographic material often starts at an extremely early age. Again, I'll remind people of Gabriel of the Hampstead children saying that he had seen pornographic photographs of himself on his daddy's laptop as a very young child. Children and teens are forced to perform all types of sexual acts for the camera, said Dominique, including things like having sex with animals. These are both cult member children and those who have been kidnapped. I missed some of this, I almost wish I... Infants are photographed with objects in their orifices for pedophile magazines and the likes. Dominique said she was flown to the Baja in Mexico for some of the pornographic, quote, shoots. These, she said, would often include a heavy emphasis on sadomasochistic themes. Restraints were used, beatings with cat of nine tails films showing actual controlled rapes. Prostitution. Another lucrative area for the cult is prostitution, said Dominique, and that too starts at an extremely early age. As early as 4 years old, a child begins to be trained, she said. They are, for instance, given drug injections to induce heightened suggestibility. Then they are taught, we think of Dr. Ewan Cameron in Canada, proven and compensated for psychic driving, hypnosis, drugging for mind control, memory wiping. It's all documented, people. Then they are taught how to perform sexual acts such as oral sex. And Ghislaine Maxwell is accused of training the trafficked youngsters that she and others procured for Jeffrey Epstein's little organization. And Ghislaine is alleged to have done this kind of programming training for sexual performance and service. And they are also taught through demonstration all the possible sexual things that could be done to them, including some pretty violent abuse. However, part of the desensitization process is to keep encoding the concept pain is pleasure, so they can psychologically and physically endure. And Angelina Jolie spoke about this. There's a video of her admitting being hurt in a ritual and saying that same thing, that if you mind over matter, if you tell yourself pain is pleasure, you can get through it. Once the child was ready, said Dominique, they would be, for instance, taken to the houses of people, in the homes of people in the community who had contracted with the cult for sexual services. Brackets, some of the children from the daycare settings consistently reported being taken off site for the same thing. Dominique said the children would be taken to individual paedophiles, couples, and so on. Sometimes children would be taken along with these people on vacations. Over time, the child would progressively be exposed to more and more paedophiles. In addition, said Dominique, the cult would also arrange parties where the children and teens would be used sexually. We've heard children's home survivors talk of these parties incessantly, especially in the UK. These parties would sometimes include people the cult was trying to influence, whether law enforcement officials, judges, state representatives, and so on. Also, teen and adult prostitutes would have quotas on how much money they needed to generate a week on the, quote, outside. Dominique said in her particular cult, this would range anywhere from $250 to $400 a week. Yeah, that always amazed me about the Hampstead disclosures, was the children said in one disclosure that the sex days on Wednesdays at their school, where people would come to have sex with the children, according to their testimony, I think in one disclosure they said that it was something like they paid daddy something like £50 each. And I remember thinking that was very low if you compare it to the satanic rituals and the other horrors that they endured. But this seems to corroborate that. So where a child might be being filmed in Mexico and used in rituals, but they would be expected to generate 250 to 400 a week on the outside. So, you know, it's mind-blowing. Breeders. Another report that comes up consistently among cult survivors is the existence of, quote, breeders within the cults. That is, women who are designated to have babies for the cult. Some, said Dominique, are used for sacrifice, while others are clandestinely sold to families wanting children. And some are bred specifically to carry on the transgenerational cult bloodline. The babies born of breeders in her cult, said Dominique, were never born in a hospital, so there was no birth record. Also, she said her cult had a doctor who took care of those who were pregnant. Recruitment. Dominique said she and others were used as recruiters. They were taken to other communities to get to know inverted commas, latchkey kids. These were youths from dysfunctional families who were having difficulty at home, in school. Some were rebellious or loners, and so on. This is why I think the social engineering, forgive me for keep editing, but this is my field of research, sadly. This is why I think the social engineering to get women into the workplace and encourage children into daycare and state care and encourage the housing of single parents and the breakdown of the nuclear family has been encouraged, because children are more accessible if they come from a fragile or broken home. And it could be the best parent in the world, but if she's having to work 2 jobs and her kids have to let themselves in and miss a traditional family life, with the best will in the world, those children are vulnerable. Dominique said her job was to target such youth and befriend them. Eventually, they would be told about this, quote, group they could go to where they would experience unlimited power and unlimited sex. A young child, Dominique said, might be lured with the promise of getting a pet or another type of gift. They would be taken immediately. Some teens would also be transported immediately back by the cult, while others, said Dominique, would be given money for a bus ticket and told someone would be there to pick them up at the community where the cult was. Again, I refer you to Spotlight blog and the Scorpion Project and runaways from Suffolk being given train fare to London and being met at King's Cross and then being grabbed straight into prostitution or cults, and vice versa. There was a big transit between London and Suffolk, and the same between Dublin and Belfast. When they arrived, they'd be taken to a rural setting where cult members had homes. There they would be prepared for sacrifice, or forced indoctrination procedures would be initiated. Disposal of bodies. Dominique said there were a number of ways the sacrificial victims' bodies were disposed of. She said this was taken very seriously and was the responsibility of the, quote, upper members of in the cult. First, she said, Jesus, the heart would be removed, then the blood drained. Brackets, both essential to some ceremonies. Then the victim's body was often dismembered. Sometimes the body would then be put into a pit of fire if the ceremony was being conducted outside. Brackets, there are also reports small portable crematoriums are used. There's also reports, and Sean Atwood has had guests talk about this, of people involved in this kind of thing buying a morgue or a funeral home business for easy disposal of bodies, amongst other things. Minneapolis Sergeant John Hinchcliffe said another disposal method he's heard of is mixing victims' bones with farm animal feed. Dominique said cult members also filled the bottoms of huge metal drums with body parts and concrete and hid them on rural property owned by members. In other instances, Dominique said her uncle would sometimes take the remains out to sea in his boat. Yet another way to destroy a body is with a strong acid solution. Horror in the Netherlands. According to a series of May 1993, the Press Association Limited stories, Zurich computer businessman René Osterwalder and his law student girlfriend, Augusta Schoenberger, interesting. Not Schoenberger, but Schoenberger, were charged with torture and sexual abuse of a 6-month-old girl and a 2-year-old girl, among perhaps others, for child porn films. An extradition request said the torture of infants included, quote, application of electric shocks, induction of suffocation by lengthy immersions in a bathtub, and covering with plastic bags. It also said the children were bound, smeared with feces, and needles were applied to the genital areas. Authorities also accused the couple of driving through the Dutch countryside in search of victims. It was reported they had in their car a large ventilated suitcase, handcuffs, and a gag. According to a January 27, 1993 Associated Newspaper Limited story, police found a torture chamber and 2 barrels of acid, one containing dissolved flesh, at the couple's holiday chalet near Saint-Ursanne, northeast Switzerland. Osterwalder's flat was in a building known locally as the Satanic Church, which specialized in depraved live sex orgies, said the article. Serial cult killings. A cult survivor now living in New Mexico said her father was involved in both Satanism and random serial killing of women. Quote, Rose, said her father, would abduct and kill women from states in the Northwest and bring them home, where he and other cult members would cannibalize the flesh. She said her mother would actually cook the flesh, and sausages would be made from some of the body parts. What's more, Rose said her father actually demonstrated a craving for blood. I've heard this in other places. Brackett's confessed satanic killer Sean Sellers said he acquired a craving for blood, and he would actually carry around a vial with his blood as a fix. I refer you to adrenochrome. Besides, and they talk about this with animals as well. My father used to breed and train gun dogs to an incredibly high standard, beloved of the cult. And if a dog got blood, it would be spoiled for life sometimes, because it, instead of retrieving an animal that had been cleanly shot for consumption, or killing a pheasant or a duck or whatever, if a dog had escaped and got the taste for blood, it would try and eat the prey rather than retrieve it. So this bears up. Besides flesh and other body parts, Rose said her father would keep many of the skulls of his victims. Bracket Satanists also believe the power of the intellect is supreme, and since the skull is the container of the brain, it is held in reverence. That's one of the reasons it is used as such a consistent symbol by cult groups, and may have been the reason, for instance, that the cult in Norwalk, Ohio, had broken into the cemetery to steal the skulls. After the human parts were used, Rose said he would take the remains and place them in a box. He would take the boxes to the city incinerator. Quote, he used to laugh if they knew what they were burning, said Rose. Don't talk. Rose tried to tell someone. When she was 8 years old, stories of the serial killings were all over the papers and the FBI was investigating. Rose sent a letter to a disc jockey of a children's radio station, asking him to forward the letter to the FBI. Brackets, she didn't know how to contact the FBI directly. Oh my God. The disc jockey instead contacted her parents. The man, said Rose, came to the house and the parents, of course, said everything was fine and their child was just a bit disturbed. After this, said Rose, she was tortured extensively and threatened with going to the children's electric chair if she ever tried to tell anyone else. What an idiot. What's more, a situation was set up to give her identification with the perpetrators, encoding the code of silence even deeper. Rose's family lived in a rural area near railroad tracks. Rose said her father hired a, quote, hobo to dig a hole, etc., for a septic tank system. It took about a month, and during this time, Rose made friends with the man. However, when the job was done, Rose said her father drove her and the man far back into the woods. Rose had been taught to shoot as a child. And the father, holding a gun to her head, told her to shoot the man. Shoot him or I'll kill you, she said her father threatened. She shot him. Note, ritual abuse victims often report being put in a double bind situation, like being forced to help with the killing. And I will never forget Gabriel and Lisa's alarm as they disclosed to Abraham that they had cut the throats of babies, and they seemed so triggered and they were so glad to be able to say, but Daddy made us do it. Daddy held the knife. Daddy held our hands. And Daddy went like this because we weren't strong enough. But before they spoke that out, you could see in their eyes the absolute terror of we're guilty too, you know, and they were 8 and 9 at the time of those disclosures. I just finished. I'll just wait for the next part. I'm going to just break for a second here. This increases, being forced to help with a killing increases the overwhelming sense of powerlessness in the victim, introduces a profound element of guilt, and increases the victim's identification with the perpetrators, said ritual abuse awareness advocate Karen Stardancer. So I'll just break for a second here, excuse me. Go back to where we were, sorry about that. Networking. Dominique's uncle, the North Carolina high priest, trained Satanists in the United States and Canada in different workings of the cult. As mentioned in the beginning of the book, concern is mounting regarding the increase of indications of networking between the different sadistic hate groups. And this becomes increasingly common because of the internet and the dark web. Northern California ritual crime investigator Randy Cerny said he was once a clandestine observer at a stakeout of a Ku Klux Klan outdoor ceremony in Stanislaus County, California, where known Satanists with reported ties to a, quote, skinhead group were in attendance. In an interview for the Breaking the Circle book, a therapist and researcher at the Menninger Foundation Psychiatric Hospital in Topeka, Kansas, also talked about an indication of some crossover links. One of Carolyn Graham's ritual abuse patients talked of being drawn into a satanic cult comprised of a mix of teens and adults. The person reported he eventually left this cult, got involved with the Ku Klux Klan, and later with the neo-Nazis. Chapter 13. A cover-up in Nebraska, question mark. Refer you to A Conspiracy of Silence, the Channel 4 documentary that was pulled at the last moment and the television channel sold to avoid its airing. You can find it on YouTube. A Conspiracy of Silence. Omaha, Nebraska's Franklin Community Federal Credit Union is shut down in 1988. Some $40 million is missing. A legislative committee, the Franklin Committee, is appointed to investigate. The trail soon leads beyond missing money to what appears to be a national and perhaps even international organized crime syndicate engaged in satanic ritual murder, pedophilia, pornography, drugs, and money laundering. Former Nebraska Senator John DeCamp served on the Franklin Committee. Brackett's a highly decorated Vietnam War veteran. He now practices law in Lincoln, Nebraska. I think John DeCamp might be dead now, I'm not sure. Through extensive research, DeCamp is convinced this satanic syndicate exists and that the syndicate went to extraordinary lengths to harass, discredit, and perhaps even murder those trying to bring this to justice. DeCamp characterizes it as perhaps the biggest cover-up since the Warren Commission. And it is also another possible example of how far and high up Satanists may have woven themselves into the fabric of modern society. Absolutely. The following are excerpts from DeCamp's book, The Franklin Cover-Up, with a series of supplemental interviews. Explosion in the air, question mark. Gary Caradori was one of the chief investigators for the Franklin Committee. That is until July 11th, 1990. That day, Caradori was flying back to Nebraska with his 8-year-old son in a private plane. They had been to the All-Star baseball game in Chicago. At 2:30 a.m., a farmer in Lee County, Illinois, reported he saw a flash of light, heard an explosion, and saw a plane plunge to the ground. Caradori and his son were dead. The report of the explosion in the air made the early edition of one of Nebraska's TV news stations, said DeCamp, but was pulled from subsequent reports. The later reports, said DeCamp, indicated the plane exploded on impact. DeCamp said Caradori had received numerous threats on his life, believed to be because during the Franklin investigation, Caradori had obtained information some of those tied to the Franklin case had perpetrated any number of child sexual abuse crimes and were practicing Satanism. Quote, from 1988, when the Franklin case first broke into public view, until mid-1991, at least 15 people associated with the case as investigators, alleged perpetrators, or potential witnesses died sudden deaths, many of them violent, said DeCamp. A major target of the investigation was Larry King, who was the head of the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union. As the story unraveled, allegations would surface. He was tied to pornography, sex rings, and Satanism. Stories of child pornography started to surface from reports made by young girls from North Omaha Girls Club. Excuse me. DeCamp said some of the girls told social worker Julie Waters they had been taken to parties where they and other children had been abused sexually and were forced to comply with the making of pornography. The girls also talked about being flown to other parts of the country at times to similar parties, even to Washington, D.C. They also alleged King had often been involved, said DeCamp. One of the girls was admitted to a hospital, and as she began to trust the staff, she revealed more. Not only was there sexual abuse with middle-aged men, some of the, quote, parties would get more intense as elements of devil worship were introduced, said DeCamp. According to hospital reports chronicled in DeCamp's book, She was locked in a room with a little girl, which she described as a Caucasian infant. At about midnight, Loretta indicated the men came into the room, took the little girl away from her, and told her that she could achieve power by killing something she really loved. Oh, Jesus. Loretta described that they then cut the little girl's head off, stuck it on the wall, and made her sit in front of it. She would go on to describe other satanic sacrifices and also the nature of threats used to keep the girls quiet. Loretta indicated that the men would try to scare the girls by having them watch animals being mutilated. And also the men would threaten them by saying that instead of killing them, that they would just cut off parts of their bodies. According to DeCamp's research, Loretta's story was also starting to match up with several other youths' reports about the same perpetrators. In this case, as with others that have been described earlier, a pattern of suppression apparently started to kick in. Even though Loretta was revealing more and more, neither the hospital nor DeCamp could get police to come out for follow-up interviews with the girl. And the officer who had performed the initial interview and had initially expressed interest in following up was transferred to another department, said DeCamp. According to Franklin Investigative Committee member Senator Ernie Chambers, quote, I felt the officer had been transferred because he was getting too close to something and his superiors did not want him to continue. Brackets, the officer would later testify before the Franklin Committee that he thought Loretta's charges were credible and he thought they deserved to be followed up on. Since there was no follow-up response from local law enforcement, Carol Stitt went directly to Nebraska Governor Kay Orr, who told her to, quote, do whatever is necessary to secure an investigation, said DeCamp. Stitt then went to the state attorney general's office with testimony from the girls claiming abuse. Shortly after, said DeCamp, several boys from Nebraska's Boys Town also came forward reporting sexual abuse, murder, and Satanism in connection with Larry King and his group. Both the girls from Girls Club and these boys were made wards of the state. However, the Attorney General's office, according to DeCamp, was extremely slow in acting, which led to Stitt saying to the Franklin Committee, I'd like to say if the state continues to handle the case the way they've handled it, everything this perpetrator has told them is being reinforced. That he has the power, there's nothing they can do, nobody's going to help them. Jerry Lowe had been hired before Caradori as the first Franklin Committee investigator. On February the 15th, 1989, Lowe sent a memo to the committee on the results of his first comprehensive evaluation of the cases. DeCamp cites the memo, quote, this matter is indeed a complex and complicated one, commencing with the closing of the Franklin Credit Union and mushrooming into a situation where additional allegations, other than the financial improprieties, have risen, including influence peddling, child abuse and neglect, child sexual abuse, pornography, substance abuse, homicide, and inaction and possibly malfeasance on the part of law enforcement agencies, and public officials for events dating several years back. More importantly, there seems to be a growing public perception that many of the affected agencies and or officials are participating in the cover-up indeed. The allegations regarding the exploitation of children are indeed disturbing. What appears to be documented cases of child abuse and sexual abuse dating back several years with no enforcement action being taken by the appropriate agencies is on its face mind-boggling. loaded extensive taped interviews with alleged victims. They talked consistently of sexual abuse, satanic activity, being transported as part of sex rings. Note, as hard as it is for many to believe children could be exploited like this, it's going on in proverbial broad daylight these days in society as well. Again, according to the June 21st, 1993 Time magazine article on global child prostitution, quote, "The exploitation exemplifies the single most unsavory element of worldwide growth in the sex trade, an explosion in child prostitution." That's such an anomaly. There is no such thing. If it's a child, that's child rape and slavery. That's not prostitution. The child doesn't offer themselves for money. Estimates of the number of US prostitutes under the age of 18 range from 90,000 to 300,000. This was in the early 90s. Pederasts in particular have lots of help finding a good time in Asia, Africa, or Latin America. Numerous gay market publications and computer networks provide information. Paedophile Information Exchange, the Monday Club, the dark web in almost its entirety. One of the most notorious guides to world sex spas for homosexuals seeking boys is called the Spartacus International Gay Guide. Yeah, that's another one from London. Available since the 1970s, it's now published in Germany in several languages. Program of deception. The World Herald is Nebraska's biggest newspaper. DeCamp alleges its integrity and credibility, quote, "went on the chopping block for the sake of suppressing the truth about the Franklin case." Over and over, claimed DeCamp, the article's slants were that the Franklin sex scandal, pedophilia and drug abuse stories were trumped up. It's a hoax. Not. DeCamp referred to what he perceived the World Herald was doing as a, quote, "program of deception." Incidentally, World Herald publisher Harold Anderson was also on the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union Advisory Board, said DeCamp. Verdict. Franklin investigators came across another victim witness who, as a youth, claimed to have been taken as a child prostitute on numerous trips to places like Washington, D.C., Des Moines, Minneapolis, Houston, St. Louis, Pasadena, Grand Island, by some of the same alleged perpetrators. He also reported being forced to be involved with a snuff film, said DeCamp. On July 23, 1990, 12 days after the sudden death of Gary Caradori, the Douglas County grand jury ruled, quote, "We found no credible evidence of child sexual abuse, interstate transportation of minors, drug trafficking, or participation in a pornography ring by Larry King or other Franklin Credit Union officials," close brackets. My God. Yes, Larry King had diverted credit union funds, the grand jury said. And it also ruled he used some of the money to entice men in their late teens and early 20s to engage in acts of prostitution, committing merely the crime of pandering, said DeCamp. Jesus. Everyone else was cleared. However, victim witness Alicia Owen and Paul Benassi were indicted for lying to the grand jury about the abuse. There's so many parallels with what's going on today. At the time of the indictment, Owen was 19 years old and Benassi was 18 years old. The case also included testimony from children claiming they had been abused in a foster home. They claimed extreme sexual and satanic ritual abuse at the hands of the parents in 1985. The father, Jarrett Webb, said DeCamp, was a board member of the Franklin Credit Union, and his wife, Barbara, is Larry King's cousin. This had been the first red flag in the overall Franklin case, said de Camp. While the children were taken out of the home by social service workers in 1985, the grand jury offered its opinions, said de Camp, that it was unfortunate that so much time elapsed between the first allegations of abuse and the time the children were removed from the home. De Camp also said the grand jury report contained such gratuitous pronouncements as, quote, children do not have the right to expect that if they exhibit reasonable behavior, they will not be abused. What? De Camp also said the grand jury referred to the social services caseworkers as, quote, rumor mongers. Can't get my head around that quote. Trish Lamphere, head of the Concerned Parents Group, blasted the indictments of the victim witnesses. This is a sick jury, turning the victim into the perpetrator. This is so classic. Dr. Julianne Denson-Gerber, who had been brought in as an expert consultant by the Franklin Committee, had found the victims credible and had just as incredulous a response to the indictments. This is unprecedented, probably in the history of the United States, said Denson-Gerber, a lawyer, psychiatrist, and prominent specialist on child abuse. Quote, if the children are not telling the truth, particularly if they've been abused, they need help, medical attention. You don't throw them in jail. De Camp said the grand jury has said one of the witnesses, Paul Bonassi, had been a, quote, pathetic witness who had been diagnosed with MPD. He was being viewed by them as being, quote, crazy, said de Camp. They didn't know anything about multiplicity, didn't have the remotest idea what they were dealing with. De Camp said he believed this also demonstrated the, quote, overwhelming influence the prosecutor was able to exert in trying to discredit Bonassi. De Camp filed a civil suit against the grand jury in retaliation. The basis for the suit, said de Camp, was he believed in this case the grand jury had acted as the grand jury for Watergate had acted. That is, said de Camp, they found out who knew what beforehand, and then a strategy was crafted to discredit the victims. Omaha business community. According to Franklin Committee member Senator Ernie Chambers, quote, what Larry King is doing is the tip of an iceberg, and he's not doing it by himself. De Camp contends behind King's rise stood some of the most powerful figures in Nebraska politics and finance. The following is an excerpt from the Franklin cover-up. In Gary Caradori's files is the transcript of a February 12, 1989 phone conversation with Sheila McGuire, aka Sheila Calder, former manager of the French Cafe. This night spot, partly owned by Larry King, was named by victim witnesses as a center for sexual abuse. The following is what Caradori wrote Calder had said. We had parties in my apartment above the French Cafe. Larry King would wine and dine potential investors downstairs at the cafe. When the French Cafe closed at about 1 a.m., King and his man, called Parking Lot Bob, who worked for him and was our Coke connection, would bring people upstairs to my place. If Larry King investors wanted drugs, booze, children, or hookers, male or female, we'd get them. While these guests of King's took their pleasures with the kids or whoever, King would sit and watch while he drank, did coke, and played with his young boys. King took good care of the local and out-of-town high rollers. If you had the money to invest at Franklin, King would cater to your most deranged perversion. And let me tell you another thing. The boys in the boardrooms around Omaha are shitting in their brogans. If this case gets cracked open, the list of involved will read like a who's who. King and his crew have ruined a lot of children's lives. For over a century, said DeCamp, the Omaha business community has been organized around the Knights of Aksar Ben, a quasi-Freemasonic social organization centered on a racetrack and fairgrounds in Omaha. Spell Nebraska backwards and you get the name. Aksar Ben. Founded in 1895, Aksar Ben functions as a sort of central committee of corporate elite and self-perceived oligarchy for the city, DeCamp maintains. DeCamp also said many corporations connected to people in Aksar Ben have poured millions into Franklin Credit Union. DeCamp also notes Larry King got backing from Warren Buffett's socialite wife in his early rise. Brackets in 1993, Warren Buffett was listed in Forbes magazine's top 10 billionaires in the world. Based in Omaha, DeCamp said Buffett is the second biggest stockholder in the Washington Post and is a controlling power in ABC TV. Washington connection. The Franklin tentacles may have been much more far-reaching than Nebraska. DeCamp said Senator Schmidt, who was on the Franklin committee, was warned by an anonymous caller not to pursue the case because, quote, it would lead to the highest levels of the Republican Party. In a political viewpoint column, November 24, 1983, Ernest E. Bryant wrote, Chairman Larry King has accepted a position in the Reagan-Bush re-election campaign. He was appointed by National Black Republican Council Chairperson Legree Daniels, who was named Chairperson of the Black Voters for the campaign in the Reagan-Bush 84 re-election bid. The article goes on to explain that King would be responsible for meeting with party officials and organizing campaign strategies within a 17-state region. In this position, King put on parties for some of these officials. At the 1984 Dallas Republican Convention, DeCamp said King had put on a gala event at South Fork Ranch, the location where some of the TV show Dallas was filmed. DeCamp attended the party. Victim witness Paul Bonassi also said he remembers being there. He said he'd been flown in to provide sexual favors behind the scenes for some of the guests. DeCamp said when he found out Bonassi had been at the party, he questioned him about a number of things specific to that night. And after the conversation, DeCamp said he was unequivocally convinced Bonassi had indeed been at the party. Cover-up phase 3, the FBI. DeCamp also states, quote, the Justice Department, acting through the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Omaha, emerges from the record of the Franklin investigation not so much as a party to the cover-up, but as its coordinator. Rigging grand juries, harassment of witnesses, incitement to perjury, and tampering with evidence. Federal personnel were seen to apply all of these techniques in the Franklin case. DeCamp cites more information from investigator Gary Caradori's notes. This is an excerpt from a conversation with a confidential informant. Quote, Gary Caradori, are the federal people still putting me down? Have you heard? I mean, they want me off the case. CI, well, they don't want anybody to get too close to it. This thing is way bigger than Nebraska. You get one of those dominoes to fall, I think it could reach the White House and back so fast. DeCamp's supposition is this is the main reason the harassment and cover-up attempts have been so seemingly intensive. DeCamp cites more of Caradori's notes, April 20th, 1990. At approximately 14:15, this writer received a telephone call from Alicia Owen, one of the victim witnesses. She talked about the FBI hinting to her that if she changed her story, that they would ensure her they would go after this writer and Mike Casey for fabricating an investigation. She informed me she had not fabricated any part of any story and that she was sticking to the story she had told me and that she wished me well. For my own protection, I tape recorded the telephone conversation, which lasted approximately 30 minutes. Satanic and pedophile activity. I've had that done to me where I ran a group with 5 other adults, a group for vulnerable teenagers, and 2 of them were approached by a local bad cop and told that he could make some charges for them for joyriding or something disappear, or if they would say that I was inducing them to watch porn and have sex with myself or my daughter. They did go ahead and put the rumor around for a couple of weeks, and then I met them and said, what the fuck is going on? And that's when they told me. He told us he would make our upcoming court case disappear if we said that, and we're so sorry, and we'll tell people we lied. Satanic and pedophile activity. The Douglas County Grand Jury acknowledged that the allegations in the Franklin case, quote, necessitated our study of satanic and pedophile activity in eastern Nebraska. From the Franklin cover-up. According to testimony from Paul Bonassi, Larry King had been recruited to a satanic cult by December 1989 at the latest. In his written history, Bonassi described how King picked him up after school one day in December, quote, and took me to the Triangle, which is in a wooded area in Sharp County. I witnessed a sacrifice of a human baby boy. Everyone was chanting, and it was a yearly ritual around the time of Christ's birth to pervert the blood of Christ. They used daggers and cut the body and filled a cup with his blood and mixed urine in it and forced all of us to drink from the cup and chant, Satan is Lord, Lucifer our King, realm of darkness come now and empower us, your slaves. Then they all began to chant some weird sounds, and I got scared and was threatened I'd become the next sacrifice if I ever told anybody about it. Note, Bonassi reports being taken to the Triangle to witness a satanic sacrifice. In Ohio, Detective Casada finds a triangle configuration at an alleged backwoods ritual site. According to the book Exposing and Confronting Satan and Associates, in Satanism, the triangle sometimes represents fire or male virility. Satanists will also use the geometric configuration of a triangle or a circle to call demons into. Kathleen Sorensen became the foster parent that had taken in the children that had been taken from the Webb home in Nebraska in 1985. There were consistent claims of sexual and ritual abuse. Sorensen decided to speak out about what she was hearing from the children and went around the state giving talks and eventually ended up on the Geraldo Rivera's nationally syndicated show on Satanism. On another television show shortly after, Sorensen said, as you listen to us talk about these things, ritual abuse, there will be a natural part of you which will deny much of what you hear. And believe me, we did too. I would like to share this with you, partly in children's words, so that you can hear the things that they said that nobody can make up, that no child could know. That's what eventually convinced me, along with deep emotion, the grieving, screeching, damage and hurt that they cry out with as they talk. Many are sent to psychiatric hospitals where they are labeled psychotics or schizophrenics. I praise God that He brought so many of them into my life and through our home, and that there are other families like ours. It's just a movement of the Holy Spirit. It's the only way I can explain it. De Camp said Kathleen Sorensen was aware it was dangerous for her to go public at the time. She was killed in a head-on car crash in 1989. Wow. De Camp said ritual abuse investigator Ted Gunderson investigated the accident and said there was a possibility it was a Satanist contract or a suicide. A Satanist contract, suicide. Brackets, in some Satanic law, according to Gunderson, a person who sacrifices his or her life like this for Satan will be reincarnated with more power. So that's in Gunderson's implying that that person was in the cult. Camp explained Sorensen was driving a stretch of road between Fremont, Nebraska and her home in Blair. At least several people, said Camp, knew which road she would be on and at what time. Oh, right, so maybe it was a suicide, the person that crashed into her head on. Right, now I get it. Another car coming from the opposite direction crossed the yellow line and rammed into Sorensen's car. Now I get it, so it's like a Harry. Not even like that, it's like a suicide bomber. Sentenced. DeCamp notes Larry King was sent to prison, but again, not for child abuse. Under a plea bargain arrangement finalized with federal prosecutors on June 17, 1991, King is serving a 15-year sentence for embezzlement, conspiracy, and making false financial record entries. Since the Douglas County grand jury deferred to the federal authorities, said DeCamp, and since there was no trial of King on the federal embezzlement or any other charges, the evidence of child prostitution and abuse allegedly perpetrated by King was never prosecuted, never presented in any court. And again, I have to say, the evidence for the children's allegations in the Hampstead case has never been presented in court other than in a limited fashion by the father to say the mother coached them to say terrible things. The mother and the stepfather who took the disclosures have never had an honest day in court with the opportunity to present their evidence and for the children to be questioned if that were before they got sucked back into the system, allegedly. On August the 8th, so I was saying there've been more court cases going after the campaigners and whistleblowers and advocates for the children than a cursory 12-day fact-finding mission which didn't even examine all the facts and which stood on the absence of a police investigation, no crime scenes forensically examined, no body piercings or tattoos, identifying marks examined on the alleged abusers, no confiscation of technology from the alleged abusers, just absolutely scandalous. On August the 8th, 1991, however, the victim witness Alicia Owen, listen to this, was sentenced to 3 consecutive 3 to 9 year prison terms for perjury, said DeCamp. Shortly after, the charges of perjury against Paul Benassi were dropped. That poor girl. By this time, DeCamp was legal representative for Benassi and had put together a case including much of the evidence just described. DeCamp said he believed, quote, they dropped the charges so that the truth would never come out. What kind of representation did Alicia Owen have, or lack of it, for her to end up with 3 consecutive 3 to 9 years, 9 to 27 years in prison? I think she served about 25. Oh, it's just devastating. And that brave little girl refused to change her story when she was offered a deal. I'd like to know if she's still alive and if she survived the horror of the cover-up and the imprisonment. By this time, DeCamp was legal representative. Yeah, he says he thinks they dropped the charges so that the truth would never come out. See, this is my assertion as well with Hampstead. The reason they've made no real effort to go after the mother and her then boyfriend is because they don't want the truth to come out. And they know that if the mother and Abraham were before a jury and able to present all their evidence, the truth would come out. Besides some of the information already talked about, Benassi has also described a network of safe homes where the pedophile ring stored kidnapped children before selling them. He said children would be kidnapped and then taken to Las Vegas, where they were auctioned at a ranch. DeCamp now also represents Alicia Owens free of charge. He believes strongly in the credibility of both their stories. Quote, if I still had the luxury of believing, as I once did, that all allegations of drug abuse, child abuse, pedophilia, theft, and satanic cult activity were exaggerated imaginings of some overactive child and adult imaginations, then I would not have to do anything about Franklin. I could still be enjoying an income of $400,000 a year as a lobbyist without having to work too hard, instead of being financially strangled as clients are intimidated away from hiring me because of the Franklin connection. How do I know that it's true? And because of but I do know that it's true. And because of my upbringing, I have no choice but to plow ahead. For more information about the book, The Franklin Cover-Up by John DeCamp, see the bibliography. Mafia doesn't exist, ? It's important to put some things in context at this point in light of the Nebraska case and the possibility of similar conspiracies and cover-ups. For instance, I mentioned the mafia earlier in the book. We know unequivocally now that during the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, in the United States, the mafia was and is a vast national and international organization directed by known, quote, godfathers of crime. They ran a multitude of, quote, rackets. They ran drugs, extorted money, murdered, bribed, and blackmailed all kinds of government officials. However, incredibly, it wouldn't be until the mid-1950s that that information would finally start to be made public through the Valachi papers, an expose by a former La Cosa Nostra member. And this would be further supplemented in November of 1957, when a rural policeman in Appalachian, New York, came across a gathering of 63 top mobsters from 15 states. They were assembled at the palatial home of Sicilian killer Joe Barbara for what could be described as a mafia convention. Anthony Summers writes in his book, Hidden Hoover. Summers points out this incident confirmed what a lot of law enforcement officers already knew about the mafia and its extensiveness. However, it had hardly been investigated. What's more, the high-profile head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, not only didn't authorize investigation of the mafia, he said publicly it didn't exist. According to Summers' book, Hoover, who was the director of the FBI from 1924 until his death in 1972, wow, may have had a long relationship with mafia chieftain Frank Costello. Wow. 1924 to 1972. From Hidden Hoover. In 1990, New York mob boss Carmine Lombardozzi, 80, said Costello and Hoover, quote, had contact on many occasions and over a long period. Hoover was very friendly toward the mafia families. The families made sure he was looked after when he visited racetracks in California and on the East Coast. They had an understanding. He would lay off the families, turn a blind eye. It helped that he denied we even existed. And there was more. The mafia, said Summers, apparently had proof of Hoover's persuasion towards homosexuality, and they apparently used this to neutralize the FBI. In addition, the mafia apparently even catered to Hoover's preference, according to Summers. Summers wrote one of Frank Costello's allies, Louis Solon Riesenstiel, wore the mantle of business tycoon and philanthropist. Over the years, he gave $100 million to Brandeis University, the University of Notre Dame, and hospitals in New York and Florida. Secretly, wrote Summers, he was in league with the nation's top mobsters and had a corrupt relationship with Hoover. He and Hoover, moreover, reportedly took part in bizarre sex orgies. Ritual abuse doesn't exist either, question mark. Now let's jump to the late 80s. Reports of satanic ritual abuse are increasing almost exponentially. Ritual abuse task forces are starting to form to fight back. Hospital treatment programs are starting to develop to help survivors. Safe houses are evolving. Then in October 1989, and updated in 1992, the FBI Academy's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime in Quantico, Virginia, releases what is to become an often cited report, especially by those trying to debunk all of this, that there is no tangible evidence to substantiate there are any transgenerational ritual abuse groups, rings, or conspiracies. I reiterate one of the excerpts from the report, brackets, a version of which was still seriously cited as recently as the April 1994 edition of Texas Monthly Magazine. Quote, the law enforcement perspective cannot ignore the lack of physical evidence, brackets, no bodies or even body hairs, fibers or fluids left by violent murders, close brackets. As graphically detailed earlier, there are bodies, dismembered body parts, hairs, fluid, mostly red, and granted some of this evidence surfaced after the release of the initial report. What's puzzling, however, is in the face of all the ritual abuse survivor reports surfacing, why the FBI would even release a document that in effect would significantly influence law enforcement agencies all over the country to minimize efforts in following up on any of these reports. The FBI report goes on to say, the difficulty in successfully committing a huge-scale conspiracy crime, the more people are involved in any crime conspiracy, the harder it is to get away with it, and human nature, intra-group conflicts resulting in individual self-serving disclosures would be bound to occur in any group involved in organized kidnapping, baby breeding, human sacrifice. The mafia committed a large-scale, quote, conspiracy crime that went undetected for decades. Not only did this entail a high degree of sophistication on their part, but it also entailed, quote, large-scale complicity on the part of politicians, business, law enforcement, including perhaps even the head of the FBI, almost certainly. The same agency that's now releasing a report that there's no evidence satanic ritual abuse exists in groups or as a conspiracy. Okay, I'll leave it for there. It looks like we've got another couple of chapters to go. We'll pick up next time with chapter 14, brainwashing and programming, which should be interesting. Angela Power Disney on YouTube and Facebook. AngelasCaches.org is my blog, no apostrophe, and CACHES, and Angie Power Disney on Twitter. Please share this, especially with those working with children.